My son told me I wasn't part of the family Christmas anymore. Just like that, no warning, no explanation. And then out of nowhere, my 5-year-old granddaughter asked, "Where's Grandpa?" The room fell silent, the kind of quiet that presses into your chest and won't let go. I'm glad you're here to hear this. Because if you've ever been cut out of something you thought was yours forever, you'll understand what's coming. And if you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who should love you, this story might hit close to home. It all started on Christmas Eve, the day we'd spent decades celebrating as one big, messy, loving family. The house was packed. The smell of cinnamon and pine was thick in the air, and laughter, at least at first, filled every corner. My wife, God rest her, would have loved seeing this crowd. She always made Christmas feel like a miracle. But this year, something was different. The warmth we'd clung to for years was replaced with a cold distance I couldn't explain. The gathering was at my son's new home, a place I'd never really felt comfortable in. Not because of the house itself, it was nice, modern, and spotless, but because of what it represented: progress, change, and apparently exclusion. My son had made it clear, though not in so many words, that I was no longer part of their plans, no longer part of their Christmas. I sat at the edge of the room, watching my family mingle, laugh, and share stories. Everyone except me. My daughter-in-law smiled at me politely but didn't pull me into any conversations. My grandchildren ran around, their joy infectious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was an outsider in my own family. It felt like I was watching a play from the wings, forgotten and no longer needed. Then came the moment that broke something inside me. My granddaughter toddled over, eyes wide and innocent, and asked the question no one wanted to answer. "Where's Grandpa?" She was looking up at my son, expecting the usual warm smile and a quick explanation. Instead, she got silence. The kind of silence that speaks volumes, the kind that makes little kids confused and adults uncomfortable. No one said a word. My son looked away, avoiding her gaze. The room felt like it had shrunk, the walls closing in around me. The festive noise died down as everyone waited for someone to fill the uncomfortable void. When no one did, the little girl looked back at me, her eyes searching. It was as if she was asking me directly, "Where is the person who's supposed to be here?" That question hit me like a punch in the gut, because the truth was I was right there. I was standing at the edge of the room, invisible in plain sight, and the family I thought I'd always have was quietly erasing me. I wanted to answer her. I wanted to say, "I'm here, Grandpa's right here." But the words stuck in my throat. I was trapped inside a moment of painful clarity. The kind of moment that makes you question everything you thought you knew about love, family, and belonging. It wasn't always like this. Growing up, Christmas was the one time of year when all the cracks in our family's armor seemed to disappear. We'd gather around the tree, exchange gifts, and tell stories until late into the night. My son used to cling to my hand, wide-eyed with wonder, and my wife would laugh, her eyes shining with happiness. Those memories were etched deep inside me, but now they felt like a distant dream. I wanted to move closer, to wrap my arms around my granddaughter and tell her that family isn't just about who's in the room, but about who's in your heart. But how could I do that when my own son had made it clear I wasn't welcome? The weight of that moment pressed down on me. I could see the confusion in my granddaughter's face, the awkward shifting of the adults around her, and the cold distance in my son's eyes. It was a silence filled with unspoken things: resentment, disappointment, and maybe regret. As the evening wore on, I felt more like a ghost than a grandfather. I existed only as a shadow of what I once was, a man who had loved fiercely, who had hoped to be a part of his family's celebrations forever. Instead, I was left on the outside looking in, wondering how we had gotten here. I thought about all the years I'd poured into this family, the sacrifices I'd made, the quiet support I'd given even when it wasn't thanked or noticed. I thought about the times my son had leaned on me, the moments we'd shared that had seemed unbreakable. And now it felt like all of that was slipping through my fingers like sand. The question, "Where's Grandpa?" wasn't just about my physical absence. It was about the absence of connection, love, and belonging. It was a question that echoed in the silent spaces between us, in the gaps where words were left unsaid. I wanted to believe there was still a chance to fix this, to find a way back into the family I thought I was part of. But the silence that followed my granddaughter's cue. Euston told me that this Christmas was different, that something fundamental had changed. The room felt heavy with unspoken truths. I could see my son's jaw tighten, his eyes darting away from mine. I could feel the tension crackling in the air like a storm about to break. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about one Christmas. It was about a lifetime of misunderstandings, regrets, and pain that had finally come to a head. I swallowed hard, trying to steady the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. I wanted to cry, to scream, to demand answers. But all I could do was sit there and wait, hoping that somehow someone would break the silence. Because if no one said anything, if we all just pretended this moment didn't happen, then what did that mean for us? What did it mean for the family I thought I was part of? The room was still. My granddaughter's innocent question had opened a door that none of us wanted to walk through. And now there was no going back. That Christmas, I was no longer just a guest or a visitor. I was a man who had been pushed to the edges, left to wonder if he still belonged at all. And as I looked around at the faces of my family, I realized that the hardest part wasn't the silence. It was the distance that had grown between us. The kind of distance that words can't bridge. The kind of distance that makes you question everything you believed about home. And so I sat there, caught between the past and the present, between love and loss, waiting to see what would come next. Because sometimes the hardest stories to tell are the ones that happen when everyone goes quiet. That night, Christmas didn't feel like Christmas. It felt like a reckoning, a moment where everything we thought was true was put to the test. And the question lingered in the air like a fragile thread waiting to be pulled. Where was Grandpa? And more importantly, where was the family he thought he had? That question would haunt me long after the last gift was unwrapped and the lights went out. Because sometimes the most painful part of family isn't the fights or the falling outs, it's the feeling of being forgotten. And that was exactly how I felt that Christmas, alone in a room full of people who should have known better. Before everything unraveled that Christmas Eve, life had its own quiet rhythm, a rhythm that felt steady, familiar, and safe. Our home, modest and filled with the smells of old wood and fresh coffee, held a certain comfort. It was the kind of place where the ticking clock on the wall marked time more than any calendar or phone did. The furniture, worn but well cared for, seemed to remember every story we'd told, every quiet evening spent together. I often found myself sinking into the old armchair by the window, watching the garden sway in the light breeze, the world outside moving at its own pace while inside the hum of life went on uninterrupted. Those mornings before the holiday rush were especially peaceful. I'd wake early, the sun just beginning to spill over the rooftops, casting a soft glow through the curtains. There was a ritual to it, making a pot of coffee, sitting down with the newspaper, and listening for the faint sounds of feet padding softly around the house. My wife, always the early riser, would be in the kitchen preparing breakfast, humming quietly to herself, the radio playing some old tune that made the whole house feel like a warm embrace. It was in these moments that I felt the most connected, not just to my family, but to the life we had built together, brick by brick, day by day. The kids, when they were younger, used to tumble into the kitchen with sleepy eyes and messy hair, grabbing toast or cereal, their laughter filling the rooms like sunlight. Even now, as adults, those mornings still carried a sense of togetherness. They'd stop by for coffee or a quick chat, sometimes pulling up a chair in the kitchen or sitting at the table with their tablets or newspapers. Those visits were casual, unplanned, but they meant everything. A reminder that no matter how busy or far apart we might be, there was still a thread connecting us all. I held onto those threads tightly because they were the fabric of our family. Christmas, in particular, had always been a time when that fabric felt strongest. The house would transform, not with grand decorations or expensive gifts, but with small, meaningful touches. The old tree, a bit crooked but sturdy, would stand proudly in the corner, its branches heavy with ornaments collected over the years. Each one carried a story: a handmade angel from a school project, a fragile glass bauble from a trip, a faded ribbon tied carefully around a sprig of holly. We never needed much more than that. The soft glow of fairy lights and the smell of pine made the whole house feel like a sanctuary from the world outside. Behind all of this was the way we came together in the kitchen, the heart of the home. Preparing the meals was less the food itself, and more about the shared experience, cutting vegetables side by side, handing down old recipes, teasing each other gently when someone burned the roast or forgot to add enough salt. The kitchen table, scuffed from years of use, was where stories were told, where jokes were shared, and where plans for the future were quietly made. I remember sitting there, watching my son and daughter chatting with their partners, feeling a swell of pride and contentment. It was a simple scene, but to me it was everything. We had our own little traditions too, the kind that didn't need to be written down or rehearsed. Each year my wife would bake her special batch of gingerbread cookies, a recipe passed down from her mother. The smell would fill the house early in the day, drawing everyone into the kitchen, eager to taste the first warm cookie fresh from the oven. My granddaughter, barely old enough to reach the counter, loved to help, dusting flour here and there and giggling when the dough stuck to her fingers. Watching her, I saw the future of the family stretching out before us, a hopeful, bright path that I wanted to be part of. There was a softness to those days, a quiet happiness that didn't always announce itself loudly but settled gently like a blanket. It was in the way my wife would catch my eye across the room and smile, in the way my son would ruffle his daughter's hair, or in the way my daughter would lean in close to whisper a funny story. These moments were small, almost ordinary, but they were the glue that held us together. I felt safe and needed, a steady presence in the lives of those I loved. Inside me, too, there was a calmness that rarely faltered. I wasn't perfect, far from it. There were regrets and mistakes, things I wished I'd done differently. But in those moments, I let myself believe that I'd done enough, that my love, steady and reliable, was enough to keep the family whole. I felt the kind of quiet pride that comes from years of showing up, of being there when it mattered most. Even on days when the world outside seemed harsh or uncertain, inside our home there was warmth and belonging. And yet, beneath that calm surface, there were subtle shifts I began to notice, almost imperceptible at first. Sometimes, when my son looked at me, there was a flicker of something I couldn't quite place, a hesitation maybe, or a guardedness. It wasn't overt, nothing dramatic, but enough to make me pause. I wondered if it was just my imagination or the natural changes that come with time. Families evolve, people grow apart and back together again. I told myself that all families had their rough edges and that ours was no different. Sometimes during those gatherings, I'd catch a moment where my presence seemed less expected, or where I was left out of a conversation just long enough to feel the distance. It was subtle, these gaps in connection, like missing stitches in a well-worn sweater. They didn't ruin the day, but they left a faint ache, a quiet question I didn't know how to voice. I tried to push those feelings aside, focusing instead on the joy and laughter that filled the room. It was easier to believe in the good moments than to confront the cracks. I remember one afternoon, just a few days before Christmas, when my son called to confirm the plans. His voice was friendly enough, but there was a briskness to it that caught me off guard. He mentioned the time, the address, and who would be there, but when I asked if I could bring anything, he hesitated before saying, "No, we've got it covered." That small pause lingered in my mind longer than it should have. I shrugged it off at the time, telling myself it was just the stress of the holidays. When I arrived at the house that evening, there was a sense of warmth in the air, lights twinkling on the porch, the faint sound of carols playing softly inside. The door opened before I could knock, and my granddaughter's face lit up with a smile. "Grandpa," she called out, reaching for my hand. My daughter and son-in-law were nearby, their eyes kind, welcoming. For a moment, that felt like the family I remembered, the one where I belonged. But then, as the evening wore on, I noticed the subtle shifts again. Conversations seemed to circle around me, but rarely included me fully. My son, who once would have pulled me aside to catch up or share a private joke, stayed just out of reach emotionally. The smiles were there, but sometimes they didn't reach the eyes. There was a polite distance, as if I was a guest rather than a part of the gathering. It was confusing and painful, but I tried to breathe through it, reminding myself that family was complicated. There were moments when my granddaughter would climb onto my lap, asking me to tell stories about when her father was little. Those were the highlights, times when the walls seemed to come down and I felt the connection that still existed beneath everything. I told her about the silly things her dad used to do, the games we played, the bedtime stories. Watching her listen intently, I found a small comfort, a reminder that love could still reach through even the most tangled relationships. Yet even as I held on to those moments, there was a growing awareness that something was shifting beneath the surface. It was in the way my son answered questions, the way my daughter exchanged quick glances, the way the room sometimes quieted a little too suddenly. I could feel a subtle tension, like a thread pulled too tight and ready to snap. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but small and constant, like the ticking clock that never stopped. That night, as I lay in bed after everyone had gone to sleep, I replayed the evening in my mind. The warmth of my granddaughter's hug, the laughter that still echoed faintly in the hallway, the smiles that hid more than they revealed. I felt a mix of gratitude and unease, a peacefulness shadowed by uncertainty. The family I knew, the one I'd held onto all these years, seemed just out of reach, close enough to see but slipping away. And then there was the one small thing that unsettled me deeply, a glance, brief and almost imperceptible, exchanged between my son and his partner. It was a look filled with a kind of careful distance, a subtle barrier I hadn't noticed before. They said nothing, but in that moment I realized something had changed. Something unspoken was growing between us, something that threatened the very foundation of what I thought was a safe, homely place. I didn't know then what that look meant or how it would shape the Christmas to come. All I knew was that beneath the calm, beneath the familiar warmth, there was a quiet warning. Something was coming, something I hadn't seen before, and it was about to change everything. The moment I first felt it, that uneasy prick of doubt threading through the familiar hum of the evening, was subtle, barely a flicker in my chest, but it wouldn't let go. We'd only just arrived, the air still crisp with winter's breath, and the house was already alive with the usual sounds. Laughter from the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, the low murmur of voices settling into old habits. Yet beneath it all, something was off. Not loud or glaring, just a quiet tension that didn't belong. I caught it first in the way my son glanced at me, a look so brief I might have been imagining it if I hadn't caught the exact edge of coolness in his eyes. He said something polite, something about the traffic or the weather, but his voice was distant, clipped, like he was keeping a careful distance. I shrugged it off at first. Family gatherings always made me a little on edge, but the feeling stuck like a shadow just beyond my reach. The subtle hints kept coming, one by one, like small stones in my shoe. I noticed how the kids hesitated when I called their names, how my son's wife avoided making eye contact when I asked about their plans for the holidays. There was a pause before the usual warm greetings. Even my granddaughter, little as she was, seemed to look at me differently, as if I were a stranger in a place I'd always belonged. It was my son's words that cut the clearest. We were in the living room, the flicker of the fire casting uneven light on the faces around us. He said it so plainly, almost without thought. "You're not really part of the family Christmas anymore." His voice was low, almost casual, but the weight behind it knocked the breath out of me. I blinked, trying to catch the meaning, the intention, but it slipped through like smoke. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to say it wasn't true, that this was my family and this was home. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just nodded slowly, hoping I'd misunderstood somehow. The room felt colder after that. I looked over at my granddaughter. She was sitting quietly on the floor, playing with a doll, her face innocent but serious beyond her years. Suddenly she looked up and with the kind of directness only a child can have asked, "Where's Grandpa?" The question was simple, but when it landed, the room went silent. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence, every smile faltered. The air thickened as if the question had pulled something hidden out into the open. My son's wife looked away, biting her lip. My son's jaw clenched, eyes narrowing just a fraction, and I realized with a cold rush that the question wasn't just about my father. It was about me, about the place I held in this gathering, in this family. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable and loud. I felt all eyes on me, but no one said a word. It was as if everyone was waiting for someone to fill the space, to explain the absence, to fix the unease, but I didn't have answers. I just sat there, heart pounding, feeling more alone than I had in years. I tried to catch my son's eye again, searching for a clue, something to hold on to, but he was looking past me, distracted, as if he was already somewhere far away. It was T. He first real crack in the wall between us, and I wasn't sure how to mend it. After a moment, someone cleared their throat softly and the chatter slowly resumed, but the warmth never quite returned. I felt like an intruder in my own home, and that thought settled heavy in my chest. As the evening wore on, those small moments kept piling up. A hand not reaching for mine, a joke that didn't include me, a glance that quickly turned away. Each one was tiny, almost insignificant on its own, but together they made a clear pattern. I found myself retreating quietly, watching the family interact without me, piecing together fragments of conversations I wasn't part of. There were mentions of plans I hadn't been invited to, of memories I wasn't included in. It was like I was standing just outside a circle that used to be mine and the edges were closing in. The doubt grew, slow and steady. Had I truly been pushed aside? Was there something I didn't know, some unspoken reason why I no longer belonged here? I tried to remind myself that families change, that people grow apart sometimes. But it didn't ease the ache. Instead, it made me more alert to every small sign, every quiet shift in tone. At one point, I overheard my son talking quietly to his wife in the kitchen. He said something about needing to keep the peace and not stirring things up. The words were vague, but the meaning was clear. There were tensions below the surface that no one wanted to confront. The realization settled like a weight. This wasn't just a bad moment or a misunderstanding. It was something deeper, more complex. Something I was being kept at arm's length from. I thought about all the years we'd spent building this family, all the Christmases filled with laughter and love. And now here I was, a stranger in the midst of it. The hardest part was watching my granddaughter, so full of life and trust, looking to me for answers I didn't have. When she asked, "Where's Grandpa?" she wasn't just looking for a story, she was searching for belonging, for connection, things I suddenly wasn't sure I could give her anymore. I sat back, the quiet turmoil inside me growing with each passing moment. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap, but the path wasn't clear. The silence between us was thick with things unsaid, with feelings I wasn't ready to face. The evening continued, the festivities going on around me, but I felt disconnected, caught in a space between what was and what might never be again. And then, just as I was starting to steel myself against the growing distance, I noticed something else, something small but unmistakable. My son's hand rested briefly on my shoulder, a touch so fleeting I almost missed it. It wasn't warm or comforting, more like a reminder, a claim, or maybe a warning. That one small gesture shifted something in me. It told me that despite everything, I wasn't entirely invisible, that this fractured family, with all its cracks and silences, still held threads connecting me to them. But it also made me realize how fragile those threads had become, how much was left unsaid. The night stretched on, and I sat with those thoughts, the question lingering in the air, unanswered and sharp. Where did I really belong in this family now? And as I watched my granddaughter drift off to sleep, her small face peaceful but marked by that earlier question, I knew the coming days would bring more revelations, more challenges to the place I thought I held. But for now, I was left with the quiet, uneasy knowledge that something had changed, and that nothing would be quite the same again. The first doubt had taken root, small and quiet, but it was there, and it was growing. The moment my granddaughter asked, "Where's Grandpa?" the room dropped into sudden silence. I could feel every eye shift toward me or maybe past me as if I were some invisible shadow lurking at the edge of the room. That simple question hit like a blow I wasn't ready for, and the weight of it knocked the wind out of me. Grandpa. The name alone was heavy with meaning, with pain. And yet nobody said a word. Nobody answered her. I wanted to say something, anything, to fill the thick silence that had wrapped itself around us like a shroud. But my throat tightened, my mind scrambled, and all I could do was swallow hard and try to steady my shaking hands. I realized then that this wasn't just a cold shoulder or a momentary lapse in warmth. The question exposed a deeper truth, a fracture I hadn't fully understood until now. Grandpa wasn't just absent from the room, he was absent from the family's story. From the narrative they told each other and their children, from the memories they revisited during big gatherings like this one. The truth was, I was an outsider and Grandpa was a ghost from a past they wanted to leave behind, unspoken and erased. I looked around at the faces, searching for some sign of sympathy, of understanding. But what I saw instead was a complex mix of comfort and avoidance. My son's eyes flickered away quickly like he was afraid to meet mine. My daughter-in-law's lips pressed into a thin line. Even my granddaughter frowned, confused by the tension swirling in the air. There it was, the collective refusal to acknowledge a part of our family history, the part I was desperate to hold on to. I wanted to ask why. Why was Grandpa erased? Why was I made to feel like I didn't belong anymore? But fear kept me silent. Fear that any question might push them further away, deepen the divide that had already grown so wide. So instead I stood there quietly, the ache in my chest growing unbearable. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare where everyone I loved was turning their backs on me and I was powerless to stop it. As the evening dragged on, I noticed more signs confirming the unspoken betrayal. Photos on the mantelpiece featured my son, his wife, and my granddaughter smiling together. But there wasn't one single picture with me or Grandpa. I reached out to touch the frame closest to me, hoping to find a trace of the family I once knew. Instead, my fingers brushed over a cold glass surface that reflected only a stranger's face staring back. The realization hit me like a punch. In their memories, in their hearts, Grandpa and by extension I had been wiped away. The meal that followed was heavy with forced cheer. Conversations buzzed around me, but none included me. My son talked about his job, his wife shared stories about their daughter's school. But whenever I tried to join in, the topic would shift abruptly, as if my presence disrupted the flow of their perfect little world. I caught glances exchanged between them, quick, subtle, but charged with meaning, a silent communication that excluded me completely. I felt my spirit crumbling piece by piece. The man who had once been my partner, my confidant, the father of my son, was now a forbidden subject. It was as if acknowledging him would unravel the fragile piece they had constructed. And if they could erase him, what did that mean for me? Was I next? Was my place in this family just as fragile, just as easily discarded? There was a moment when my granddaughter tugged at my sleeve again, her eyes wide and innocent. "Grandpa's not here," she whispered, more statement than question. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I wanted to explain, to tell her about the man who had loved her, who had been part of our lives, but I couldn't. The words caught in my throat, choked by the cold reality pressing down on me. Then out of the corner of my eye I saw it. A folded piece of paper slipped under the edge of the couch where I sat. My curiosity, mingled with a desperate need to understand, made me reach for it. The paper was yellowed, worn around the edges, and when I unfolded it, I saw it was a letter, my son's handwriting. The ink was smudged as if it had been handled countless times. I hesitated, heart pounding, before I began to read the words. The letter wasn't addressed to me, but it mentioned me harshly, accusingly. It spoke of betrayal, broken promises, and lies I couldn't accept. It blamed me for tearing the family apart, for destroying the future they wanted to build without the past dragging them down. The words stabbed at my heart, each sentence confirming fears I had tried to ignore. I could feel tears burning in my eyes, but I forced myself to keep reading. The letter detailed decisions made without me, decisions about custody, about where my granddaughter would live, about excluding me from family events. It was all there in black and white, proof of a deliberate choice to erase me from their lives. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was tangible, concrete. I sat there, the letter clutched in my trembling hands, the sound of laughter and conversation around me like a distant echo. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. How could my own son turn his back on me so completely? How could the family we had built together dissolve into this cold, unrecognizable thing? The room felt smaller, suffocating. My chest tightened as the weight of loneliness pressed down harder than ever before. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to fight for my place. But a creeping numbness spread through me instead, dulling the edges of my pain and leaving me hollow. My son's earlier gesture, the brief touch on my arm, suddenly felt like a cruel joke. Was it pity, guilt, or just a reminder of what we once had, now forever out of reach? I couldn't tell anymore. The man who had declared I wasn't part of the family was the same man who had, for a fleeting moment, shown a glimpse of connection. That contradiction tore me apart inside. I thought about all the Christmases before this one, the laughter, the shared meals, the traditions passed down. They felt like distant memories belonging to a different lifetime. Now I was a stranger, an outsider looking in. The family I had poured my heart into had turned away, leaving me with nothing but questions and a crushing sense of loss. As the evening wore on, I felt invisible, swallowed by the shadows of a family that no longer recognized me. The silence after my granddaughter's question wasn't just an absence of words, it was a chasm I couldn't cross. I was broken and the pieces scattered beyond reach. In that moment, surrounded by people who once loved me, I understood the full depth of my isolation. The discovery wasn't just that I wasn't part of the family Christmas, it was that I might never be part of that family again, and the thought shattered me completely. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back under the couch, pretending to be interested in something else while my mind spiraled out of control. The ache in my chest felt like it would never end. I wanted to cry out, but the words stuck in my throat. I was drowning in silence. The night ended with me standing by the door, watching my family depart, their goodbyes polite but distant. My son's eyes met mine one last time, a look I couldn't read. Then he turned away, leaving me alone in the empty house, the echoes of that painful Christmas hanging heavy in the air. And in that quiet, I realized I had lost not just a holiday gathering. I had lost my family, or maybe they had lost me. Either way, nothing would ever be the same. The room held its breath, the weight of my granddaughter's question thickening the silence like fog settling over a still lake. "Where's Grandpa?" she asked, innocent and bright-eyed, unaware of the storm her words had just stirred. The silence stretched on long and heavy until it finally shattered from within me, not with tears or anger, but with a quiet, measured calm I hadn't known I could summon. I folded the letter from my son again, the edges now crumpled from my grip. His words echoed in my mind, harsh and final, a verdict passed down without trial or chance for redemption. To him, I was already erased, not just from the family Christmas, but from the story itself. I wasn't part of the family anymore. That realization, sharp and cold, kindled something unexpected inside me, not despair, not pleading, something quieter, more deliberate, control. Control over what was left to me, over the narrative now fractured between us. I sat back, breathing slow, letting the silence fill the room once more. This was no longer about pain, that had done its work. Now it was about what came next, about how I would respond. I thought carefully, deliberately, mapping out the steps I would take. The anger would have been easy, a loud, messy storm that might have burned everything down but left me in ashes too. No, that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to be deliberate, to be in control of my own story, even if the family had chosen to exclude me. I looked at the scattered remnants of the evening, the plates still half full, the decorations that no longer felt festive, the faces that avoided mine like shadows sidestepping light. It was clear the family had already decided their lines. They wanted me to disappear quietly, to fade away without a trace. But I wouldn't let that happen. I began to plan. Not out of spite, but necessity, because I had to reclaim my place somehow. I had to find a way to be seen, to be heard, even if it was through cracks or whispers at first. First, I would gather the truth. I would collect every memory, every detail that tied me to that family, to their past that they pretended I never shared. I would write it down, chronicles of years spent building love, of sacrifices made in silence, of laughter and tears that belonged to all of us. Nothing left to interpretation. No room for erasure. I thought of the photographs tucked away in boxes in the attic, dusty albums filled with moments of joy and hardship, faces now unfamiliar to some but deeply familiar to me. I would digitize them, organize them, create a record that no one could deny had existed. There would be no rewriting history, no deleting the chapters where I played a role. Then I considered reaching out to others, members of the family, distant relatives, friends who had witnessed those moments when the walls were down, when the masks slipped away. If some voices had turned their backs, others might still remember the truth. I would find them quietly, one by one, and bring them back into the fold of reality. There was power in documentation, in proof. If words had been used to wound me, words would now be my shield and sword. I paused, letting the idea settle before moving deeper. This wasn't about revenge in the fiery sense, but about reclaiming dignity, about standing firm in the face of rejection and saying, I am here, I was never gone. As I sat with this new resolve, I felt the cold clarity sharpen within me. The hurt hadn't vanished, it had transformed. It was no longer a raw wound, but a focused edge, a tool I would wield with care and precision. This quiet storm was different. It was patient, strategic. As it would know. T rush recklessly into the night, but would build momentum beneath the surface until it was undeniable. The next step was communication. I knew the family would expect silence from me now, perhaps even relish it, seeing it as a form of surrender. But I would choose my words carefully, crafting a message that was unyielding yet not loud. A message that demanded acknowledgement without begging for it. I envisioned the letter I would write, not an angry tirade, but a carefully measured account of my feelings, my perspective. A letter that would remind them of the bonds they claimed to protect but had twisted into chains. That would expose the fractures they tried to hide behind polite smiles and polite silences. I imagined sending it not only to my son but to others who needed to understand the full story. A letter that would be clear, cold, and full of quiet power. Still, as the plan took shape, I reminded myself to move slowly. Every word, every step had to be deliberate. I wasn't out to destroy anyone, I simply wanted justice for myself, to be acknowledged, to be heard, to exist once again in the family's collective memory. There was a small comfort in that control. Pain had felt like chaos, this felt like order. I reflected on the years that had led to this moment, the good times and the bad, the moments of closeness and the cracks that had widened over time. I thought about how easily love could be forgotten when fear or anger took over, how fragile family ties really were. It was heartbreaking, yes, but also a lesson in strength. I realized that the family's coldness was a reflection of their own fears, their own unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Perhaps my son's exclusion of me was a way to protect himself from guilt or regret. Knowing this didn't soften the blow, but it allowed me to detach from the raw emotion and see the situation more clearly. They were not just rejecting me, they were rejecting what I represented, the past they didn't want to face, the mistakes they refused to acknowledge. That understanding gave me a strange kind of peace. I was no longer just the victim, I was a witness. An observer who could now choose how to respond rather than react. I sat quietly, letting that sink in. At the same time, a subtle shift was happening beneath the surface, something like a slow-burning ember gathering strength. It wasn't hatred, not exactly, more like a cold fire of resolve. I didn't want to punish them out of spite, but to hold them accountable in a way they couldn't ignore. To show them that erasure was not an option, that the family's history was not a story they could rewrite without consequence. In my mind, I rehearsed the quiet power of my actions, the letters, the photographs, the voices I would gather. Each piece a silent accusation, a reminder that you cannot simply erase a person and all they stood for. I thought about how I would watch patiently as their constructed narrative began to unravel, as the truth seeped back into the spaces they tried to seal shut. I imagined the discomfort it would cause, the questions it would raise, but I also reminded myself not to rush this process. Like the slow cracking of ice before a thaw, the change would come gradually, inevitably. And in that waiting, I found a strange strength, not the strength of brute force or shouting matches, but a composed, deliberate power that comes from knowing your worth and refusing to be denied it. I thought about my granddaughter again, the one who asked, "Where's Grandpa?" with such innocence. She didn't understand what had happened, didn't know the reasons behind the silence, but her question had opened the door, and now I would walk through it with steady steps. This was no longer a moment of loss, it was a turning point, and I would not let it pass in silence. The cold resolve settled in my bones as I stood up, ready to move forward. The pain still lingered, but it was no longer the center of my story. Control was. Control over my narrative, my memories, my place in this fractured family. The storm was coming, but it would be mine to command. And for the first time in a long time, I was calm, because I knew what I had to do next. And I would do it quietly, deliberately, without mercy, but not with hate, with purpose. A purpose born from pain, yes, but transformed into something stronger, something that no letter, no silence, no exclusion could ever take away. I would be back in their lives. Not as a beggar or a victim, but as a force they could no longer ignore. The question hung in the air unanswered, but I was already moving forward. Whereas Grandpa, they would find out soon enough. The room went dead silent after my granddaughter's question. Where's Grandpa? She asked, eyes wide and innocent. That one line hung there like a sudden crack in thick glass. Everyone froze, not a breath moved, not a smile dared to surface. I could feel the weight of their silence pressing down on me, heavier than any words. The question was simple, but it carried a blow that hit harder than any letter or insult ever had. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me, about all of us. I didn't speak right away. I just looked around the room. Faces shifted uncomfortably. Eyes darted away. But the truth was burning under the surface, waiting to explode. I decided then, no more hiding, no more silence. The time for quiet endurance was over. I stood up slowly, steady. The room felt smaller, tighter. My voice came out sharp, clear. "He's right here," I said, pointing to myself. "Grandpa's right here." A murmur ran through the crowd. My son's face tightened. He tried to interrupt, but I cut him off before he could. "No," I said, "let me finish." Everyone stayed quiet. "You wrote to me, told me I didn't belong, said I wasn't part of this family anymore. You erased me, pretended I didn't exist." I paused, letting the words settle. But where does that leave my memories, my years? My love, is that gone too? Did you forget that I was here before any of this, before the fights, before the grudges, before the silence? They shifted, the room spun a little. I felt my own heartbeat strong and fast. This was it, the moment to expose the lie, to reclaim what was stolen. I pulled out the old photo album I'd brought with me, thick with dust but filled with everything. Pictures of birthdays, holidays, school plays, vacations, smiling faces, hands held tight, not just my memories, ours. The families. I opened it on the table where everyone could see. "Look here," I said. "Here's the Christmas when your father was 5, holding you as a baby. Here's the summer at the lake, the day we all planted the garden together, all of it, every moment you tried to erase." The faces around me changed. Some eyes glistened with tears, some looked away ashamed. My son stared hard, his jaw clenched. "You said I wasn't family," I said, voice steady but sharp. "But these memories prove I am. They prove I always have been, and no letter, no angry words, no silence can change that." I flipped through the album faster now, each photo a blow to the wall of denial. I was there when you fell off your bike, when your mother cried in the hospital waiting room, when every laugh and every tear was shared between us. My granddaughter reached out and touched a photo. That's you, Grandpa, she said softly. Yes, it is, I said, voice cracking a little. And I'm still here, still part of this family. Whether you like it or not. Then I pulled out something else, a small box, worn but precious. Inside were letters I'd kept, letters from my son, from his mother, from others in the family. Letters that showed love, regret, connection. I waved them gently. You want proof? Here it is, proof that I belong, proof that you can't rewrite the past just because it suits you. The room was spinning now, tension thick and sharp. I saw my son's eyes flicker with doubt. I saw others whisper, look closer. They couldn't unsee what was right in front of them. Then I laid the final card down, a recording. My granddaughter's voice from years ago calling me Grandpa, my son's laughter in the background. The warmth in those sounds was undeniable. I pressed play. The room filled with the past, the warmth, the truth. When it ended, silence returned, but now it was different, heavy with understanding. I looked at my son. You can try to erase me, you can try to rewrite history, but the story is already written. And it's mine as much as yours. He swallowed hard, his face changed. I saw pain, recognition, regret. No one spoke, but the energy shifted. The family line had been drawn. My place was no longer a question. I sat back down, breathing deep. The damage was done, no more lies, no more silence, but something else stirred. The fight wasn't over, not yet, because now I had proof, allies, memories on my side, the undeniable truth, and I would use every one of them to hold my ground. The room didn't know it yet, but the game had changed. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer erased, and I wasn't going anywhere. They might try to push me out again. They might try to rewrite the story, but I had the truth, and the truth had teeth. My granddaughter's question had cracked the door open. Now it was time to walk through it with my head held high and my story told loud and clear. Because some things can't be hidden, some truths can't be buried. And some bonds can't be broken no matter how hard you try. The room was quiet now, but I felt the storm coming. I was ready, and the family would have to face it. No more silence, no more hiding, just the truth, right here, right now, and the story was far from over. The house had quieted down. The initial shock of what I'd laid out, the photos, the letters, the recordings, had settled like dust particles in a still room. I could feel it in the air, a kind of fragile stillness, the weight of unspoken thoughts pressing down on all of us. I was, yes, tired, more tired than I had thought possible, but there was a little peace in that exhaustion, a kind of relief that came from finally speaking what had been buried inside me for so long. I wasn't invisible anymore, at least not today. After everyone drifted back to their corners of the room, I stayed seated, letting the silence wash over me. I didn't rush to fill it with words because honestly I wasn't sure what else to say. What more could I say? I had laid bare my story, my truth. Now it was out there, exposed and raw. The truth, though, was a complicated thing. It didn't fix everything. It didn't mend the years of absence or erase the moments when I was an outsider looking in. Instead, it seemed to hold space for something new, something uncertain but real. There was a quiet shift, not a grand reconciliation, not even an apology, but a subtle acknowledgement that things could no longer stay the way they were. I noticed the way my granddaughter looked at me then. Her eyes were wide, a little confused, but also full of something like hope. She didn't say much after that question, "Where's Grandpa?" But her gaze felt like a bridge reaching out to me. Maybe she was the one who unknowingly opened the door, and maybe, just maybe, that door could stay open a little longer this time. I was aware, too, of who wasn't there. My son's silence was heavier than any argument. He hadn't spoken to me since I finished showing what I had brought. He didn't look at me, didn't meet my eyes. That absence was painful, like a wound that hadn't healed but had been covered up with a bandage that needed changing. I didn't know if or when that bandage would come off. I didn't know if he'd ever be ready to see me as part of the family again. But the gathering had changed, even in its quiet way. No one dismissed my presence outright after that. No one said the words that had stung so deeply before, words that made me feel like I was nothing more than a shadow, an inconvenience. Instead, there was a new kind of silence, one that felt more like waiting, maybe for understanding, maybe for healing. Later that night, after everyone had left and the house felt empty except for me, I sat with a cup of tea, the warmth seeping into my tired hands. I thought about what had been lost. So much had been lost. Years of birthdays, holidays, simple everyday moments that I would never get back. The chance to watch my son grow into the man he is now, to be there when my granddaughter took her first steps, to share in the laughter and tears that make a family whole. Those losses were real and they ached in a way that I couldn't just shake off. But I also realized that I had gained something in that moment, a kind of truth, a reclaiming of my own story. I was no longer hiding or shrinking away. I had stood up and said, I am here. That mattered, even if it felt small in the grand scheme of things. I thought about the photos I had shown, the letters, the recordings, proof that I had been a part of their lives even when they tried to deny it. It wasn't just about evidence, it was about memory, about identity, about the threads that tie us together whether we like it or not. There was a sadness in knowing that those threads had been frayed, stretched, and sometimes cut. But there was also a stubborn hope that maybe they could be mended, stitched back together with patience and time. The next days were quieter than before. The usual Christmas chaos was replaced by a cautious calm. My granddaughter still asked about Grandpa, but now it was with a softer curiosity, as if she sensed the weight that came with the question. I made a point to be there for her, to answer as honestly as I could without all the anger and hurt that had built up over the years. My son remained distant. I kept my distance, too, not out of bitterness, but out of respect for the space he seemed to need. It was hard knowing that the person I wanted to be closest to was holding onto walls I couldn't climb over yet. But I learned to accept that some things take time, maybe longer than I wanted, but time was something I was finally willing to give. In the quiet that settled over those days, I found moments to reflect on what family really meant to me now. It wasn't just about being blood or sharing a name. It wasn't about recognition or acceptance from everyone. It was about being true to myself, about holding on to the parts of my story that were mine and no one could take away. I started writing again, something I hadn't done in years, not letters to prove my place, but words for myself. I wrote about grief and hope, about loss and the courage to keep going. Writing helped me process the complicated feelings swirling in my chest, the hurt, the anger, the flicker of hope. I reached out to a cousin I hadn't spoken to in ages, someone who had always been a quiet ally in the family. We talked on the phone, slowly piecing together memories and filling gaps. It wasn't the same as having my yen or granddaughter close, but it was something. It was a reminder that family comes in many forms, and sometimes those unexpected connections can heal cracks in surprising ways. The house felt emptier without the usual holiday noise, but there was also a gentleness in that emptiness. It was a space where I could breathe without pretending, where I could feel the weight of the past without being crushed by it. I thought about the future, uncertain as it was. I didn't know if the next Christmas would be different. I didn't know if my son would ever say the words I longed to hear, words that would make me feel truly part of the family again. But I realized I didn't have to wait for those words to find peace. Peace was something I could build from within, brick by brick, moment by moment. It started with acceptance, acceptance of what was lost, what remained, and what might still come. There were days when the sadness crept back in, unexpected and sharp. But there were also days when I felt lighter, when the memories I held weren't wounds but gentle reminders of a life lived, a love given even if imperfect. I learned to hold both truths at once, the pain of exclusion and the quiet strength of survival. I learned to be okay with the messiness of it all because that was what real life looked like. One afternoon, a few weeks after Christmas, my granddaughter stopped by with a drawing she had made. It was a simple picture of a family, stick figures holding hands, with a small figure labeled Grandpa right in the middle. She handed it to me without a word, her eyes shining with something honest and unguarded. I looked at that drawing and felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, not just because it was sweet, but because it was a small piece of hope. A sign that maybe in her heart I was still part of the family after all. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about that moment. The fight to reclaim my place wasn't over. It might never be fully resolved. But there was room now for something quieter, something that didn't demand perfection or full acceptance, but simply presence. I realized that even if some doors remained closed, some windows might still be open, and sometimes that was enough to keep moving forward. The road ahead was long, uncertain, and sometimes lonely. But I was no longer walking it alone, even if the company was different from what I had imagined. I had my memories, my truth, and the love I still held inside, and for now that was enough to carry me through the silence. The next morning, I found myself reaching for the old photo album again. As I flipped through the pages, I paused at a picture of my son as a child, smiling with his arms wrapped around me. The image was faded, edges curled, but the memory it held was sharp and real. I traced the outline of his face with my finger, whispering, "I'm still here." Not looking for a response, not demanding anything, just saying it aloud for myself, because sometimes that's how healing begins, one small, honest truth at a time, one quiet moment of peace after a storm of silence. And maybe, just maybe, that was where this story would start to change. I spent a long time thinking about what happened that Christmas, the silence that fell when my granddaughter asked, "Where's Grandpa?" It was a quiet moment, but it carried so much weight. The kind of moment that stays with you not because anyone shouted or cried, but because it revealed the truth we were all avoiding. It was a question that brought the whole family to a sudden halt, reminding everyone of the invisible cracks running through us. That day I realized something important. Family isn't just about the people who show up or the ones who say the right things. Sometimes it's about those who are missing, those we hold in our hearts even when they're not physically present. Grandpa wasn't there in body, but his absence filled the room in a way none of us could ignore. It was like he was the silent thread woven through every photo, every letter, every memory I had shared with the family. And in that silence, I found something unexpected, a kind of connection, fragile but real. It's strange how family can be both a source of deep pain and profound healing. My son's words, "You're not part of the family Christmas," cut me deeply, yes. But my granddaughter's innocent question cracked open a space for something else, something softer, more hopeful. She reminded us all that family isn't defined by exclusion or distance, but by love, however complicated or imperfect it may be. I won't pretend that everything magically fixed itself after that day. The tension between me and my son didn't just disappear, and there were still moments when I felt the sting of being pushed aside. But slowly, I started to see that I could find peace without needing everyone's approval. I could accept what was without giving up on the possibility of more. That's a hard balance to strike. It takes time and patience, and aches courage to keep showing up, even when it feels like you might get hurt again. In the weeks following that Christmas, I focused on the small things, little moments with my granddaughter, quiet afternoons flipping through old albums, phone calls that didn't always end in silence. I learned to appreciate the presence of those who were willing to listen and to be present with me. And in those moments, I found a new strength. Not the kind that demands change or forces forgiveness, but the kind that gently holds space for healing to begin. Sometimes I thought about how we all carry stories that shape who we are, but often those stories are half told or told only in fragments. We hold on to our pain and our pride, and that builds walls between us. When I shared those old letters and recordings, I wasn't just revisiting the past. I was inviting my family to understand me better, to see the parts of me they might have missed or misunderstood. And while that invitation wasn't always accepted, it opened a door. That door stayed ajar even when it felt like it might close. It's amazing how children can see through the noise and hurt in ways adults sometimes can't. My granddaughter's simple question cut through years of tension and spoke a truth none of us wanted to say out loud. She reminded me that family is about presence, about being there even if imperfectly. Her curiosity was a spark that, in its own quiet way, began to melt some of the frozen spaces between us. I want to believe that hope is always possible, even in the hardest situations. That a fractured family can find new ways to come together, one hesitant step at a time. And if nothing else, that the stories we share, the memories we hold onto and pass down can be a bridge, even when the people aren't always ready to cross it. What I learned most from that Christmas was that healing isn't about grand gestures or sudden epiphanies. It's about showing up consistently with openness and a willingness to listen. It's about forgiving the silence and the hurt without pretending they never existed. And it's about creating space for the next generation to ask the questions that we were too afraid to say. I started to rebuild my relationship with my son little by little, and sometimes that meant accepting the distance. Sometimes it meant reaching out again after a long pause. I learned to take comfort in the fact that family isn't always tidy or complete, but it's real. And maybe the most important part is having the courage to keep trying. Looking back, I'm grateful for the moments of quiet and for the ones that brought tears. I'm grateful for those small cracks because they let the light in. And I'm grateful for my granddaughter whose innocence reminded us all that family begins with love in whatever form it takes. I hope my story resonates with others who have felt left out or silenced by their own families. I want you to know you're not alone in those feelings. Sometimes the hardest part is believing that a new kind of belonging is possible, even when it seems like the past is too heavy or the wounds too deep. If you're listening to this, maybe you're carrying your own story of family struggles, of longing and loss, or maybe you're finding your way toward healing too. Remember that it's okay to feel broken and hopeful at the same time. That's what makes us human. And that by sharing our stories, by speaking our truths, we create a space where healing can start. Thank you for listening to my story. It means a lot to me to share this part of my life with you. Did you like my story? Please like and subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far this story of mine travels, because stories like these aren't just mine, they belong to all of us. They remind us that even when family feels fractured or distant, the willingness to love and to listen can begin to mend what once felt broken. And sometimes that's all we need to start building a new kind of family, one that embraces all its pieces, seen and unseen. In the end, the greatest gift we can give each other is simply to be present, even in silence, and to hold space for love to grow again.